So the first thing that we're going to talk about is characteristics of a precision rifle. As long-range shooters, it's really important to us to have quality equipment. The last thing that we want is to be frustrated because our equipment is not measuring up to our expectations. So not only do we want it to be application-based for us, but we want it to be completely reliable as well. So the first component that we're going to dive into is barrel. So the barrel is one of the more important components to our rifle. It has the tough job of actually stabilizing our bullet in flight so that we can accurately predict where that bullet or projectile is going to go. So if we were to safely take out this bolt from this rifle and look down the barrel, we would see the lands and grooves of the rifling, and that twists at a certain rate. So that rate is described 1 in 10 or 1 in 8 or 1 in 7 and so on. For example, this is a .308 Winchester back here. The twist rate on this barrel is 1 in 10. What that means is for every 10 inches of this barrel, that rifling is doing 1 full rotation. Another 10 inches, it's doing 1 full rotation, and so on. So along with the twist rate, I want to know that. I also want a thicker profile barrel, depending on my application. This might vary for some people. I want the thicker profile barrel because they remain more rigid and stiff throughout a prolonged shot period. So for example, if I went and fired 10 rounds out of this rifle, there's more material here, it's going to heat up more slowly. It's also going to cool down more quickly because of the surface area I have here. Versus if I were to go ahead and fire 10 rounds out of this rifle here, you can see it has a thinner profile or contour barrel. That metal is going to heat up more quickly, but it's also going to cool down more slowly. So I can't be as aggressive with my shots on that rifle. I might have to give it a break more often because I might begin to see stringing on target. My shot groups might open up because when that metal is heating up, it's becoming malleable and leading to those inconsistencies on target. So I want to consider those characteristics. Another thing I want to consider is my muzzle device. So that's what we'll get into next. So we have several different configurations that we can run our rifles in with the muzzle devices. You can see that gun in the front. It's just straight crown. So I don't have a muzzle brake, I don't have a silencer or anything like that on there. When the projectile leaves, gases disperse and the projectile goes downrange. With straight crown setups, keep in mind that we're probably going to experience more muzzle jump depending on the cartridge that you're shooting. So it might be a little bit more difficult for you to stay on target and spot those downrange effects. Another configuration I can run my rifle in is with a muzzle brake. So with a muzzle brake, it disperses those gases in a way that mitigates recoil for us. So it's going to be easier for you to stay on target, spot those downrange effects, and then get a follow-up shot a lot quicker in that configuration. And then finally, we have the suppressor. So with the suppressor, the obvious thing is that it dampens the noise, makes that a little bit more manageable and enjoyable for us as shooters. But then also we do get recoil mitigation as well with suppressors to a degree. So it will help us to stay on target a little bit better and then also see those downrange effects and send that follow-up shot a little quicker. So the next thing we're going to talk about is stocks versus chassis. So we have some options as far as what we want to drop our barreled action in, either a stock or a chassis. If you think about stocks to begin with here, something like your old hunting rifle back at home, that thing's probably in a stock. More traditional type setup. This particular one, this green configuration over here, this is a stock setup. So if we do go this route, we have to keep in mind a couple of things. One, we want to have that bedded and we want to have pillars inserted into the stock. And what that is where this action is actually connected to that stock, it is smoothed out, the surface is smoothed out so that that action fits perfectly into the stock, and then the pillars are inserted where the action screws will be holding the barreled action onto the stock. Those get torqued down to typically 55 inch-pounds or so, and we want to make sure that that workload of those action screws is going onto those pillars and not the, in this case, fiberglass stock, or if you have like a wood stock at home, it's going to be compressing that, and that could potentially lead to inconsistencies, especially if we have a wood setup. Wood shrinks and swells in certain environments, and we just want to avoid that altogether. So having a stock with bedding and pillars inserted would be ideal. With chassis, it's a little bit more straightforward. So if we go with the chassis system, they're usually made out of a more rigid material. So it's just a matter of me selecting the correct chassis for my action footprint, and then I can drop that thing in there, torque the action screws down to the manufacturer's specified setting, and I should be good to go. So it's a little bit more plug and play in this case because it is made out of that more rigid material. With either case, either one I decide to go with, I want to keep in mind a couple of things. So this is almost a mandatory thing for me when it comes to precision rifle shooting, is I want to be able to fit the gun to me. So I want to have a length of pull adjustment, and what length of pull is actually being able to lengthen or shorten the surface that my shoulder connects to on the rifle to where my finger actually connects with the trigger. I want to be able to lengthen that or shorten that depending on my body type, so that when I mount my rifle, I see everything I need to see perfectly through my optic, and I don't have to stretch my head forward or pull it back in order to see what I need to see to make a good shot. Along with length of pull, I want to also have this adjustment right here we refer to as comb height adjustment. You can see both of these setups have that. So it's actually adjusting the height that my face actually connects to the rifle. That way I have a reference. When I connect my face to the rifle, I can see perfectly through that optic, and I'm not crushing my face into the gun, or my head isn't levitating above the back here, and I have to kind of fine tune my placement, and there's inconsistencies when I don't have that reference point. So a length of pull and a comb height adjustment are two characteristics that we look for either out of a chassis or a stock system. So with triggers on our precision rifles, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One, a good trigger goes a long ways, especially when we're shooting off of unstable barricades and things like that. If we have a nice, crisp trigger tuned to an appropriate weight for us, we can get that shot off there much more efficiently and have a higher probability of hitting our target. So with the trigger, we can get them with adjustable weight ranges. For example, it can be adjustable anywhere from 1.5 pounds to maybe 3.5 pounds, or whatever the manufacturer sets it at. So I can fine tune the trigger weight, and I can figure out what I like as a shooter and tune it to that range. With these shoes, we can get a couple of different configurations. With this rifle, you can see I have a flat straight. So with the flat straight, it's just simply a lever is basically my trigger, allowing me to connect to it and press. I have found those to be very user-friendly, and I actually personally like these trigger shoes. The flat straights allow for the ergonomics necessary to make a good shot on target. For me personally, I feel like this is a personal preference thing as well. We can also get a different configuration that we're typically used to, and that's just the traditional curved triggers, and we can see that I have a middle point where my finger connects to that trigger, and I can make a good shot with that. The big thing is just having a good crisp trigger and having it at the appropriate weight for us. That's also a personal preference thing. I run my triggers at about 1.5 pounds. For me personally, people like to run them sometimes lighter and sometimes heavier. I would say a good starting point for a beginning shooter would maybe be around the 2.5 pound trigger pull range. So now we're going to talk about the action on our rifle. So a couple of main configurations we can get our rifle in is the 2-lug design or the 3-lug design. So when I'm talking about the bolt lugs, this is the bolt out of this front rifle right here. It's these two pieces of metal on the side. When I go ahead and push the bolt forward and lock it down, those pieces of metal are actually locking the bolt forward. So this is obviously a 2-lug design. On this particular rifle, it is a 3-lug design. So some considerations with 2-lug versus 3-lug is, one, the bolt throw. So on this 3-lug design, I'll go ahead and push the bolt forward, lock it down, and the distance it takes for me to unlock this bolt, pulling up, is a little bit less on the 3-lug design. So it takes less to unlock the bolt. I can go ahead and run the bolt, reload the rifle, and lock it back down, and then I'm good to go. So that's an advantage because it keeps this area nice and clear, close to the optic. There's nothing really getting in my way. My hand's not going to scrape against my optic. So it's more conducive in that manner. Versus with the 2-lug design, the bolt throw tends to be a little bit higher on this 2-lug. So I go ahead and lift the bolt up, and it gets pretty close to the optic right here. So on this particular rifle, it is a hindrance. My thumb gets pretty close to the optic. Maybe that can be mitigated with different ring heights and things like that. Just something to consider. There can be different designs when it comes to 2-lug. So sometimes that isn't as much of an issue depending on the manufacturer that you go with. A couple other things that we want to talk about is if the action is monolithic with the scope base. So in both of these rifles right here, the optic is attached to a rail. That rail is the scope base, and it's actually detachable on both of these setups. So there's 4 screws holding that on to the action itself, and I can take that rail off. Versus I can get actions where that's actually one piece of metal. The rail is actually machined together with the action itself, and I wouldn't be able to detach that and take it off the rifle. It's not really a big deal which configuration you go with, but if you do the detachable scope base, just ensure that you put a little blue Loctite on those screws and you torque them down to about 20 inch-pounds for each of those and make sure it's properly attached. The final thing with our actions with precision rifle shooting is we would like our action to be trued and blueprinted. And basically what that is they go in and they machine critical surfaces in the action itself to be true and concentric with a true line so that when I send the bolt forward and lock it down, all of that metal, the lugs are perfectly lined up and there's no opportunity for misalignment or inconsistencies in that manner. Also, the cartridge on the bolt face itself is sitting perfect and there's also no opportunity for misalignment there either. So if we have an action that's trued and blueprinted, that would lead to greater consistency. Also, they tend to be a little bit more smoother operating when they have that machining process done. So those are some considerations for our characteristics of the rifle itself. Consider your application, what's right for you. Also consider just quality equipment. You want something that's reliable, you don't have to question it, and that'll put you in a good position to start to shoot out to longer distances.